right, so as we begin our study of chapter 20, we're going to be talking about homeostasis and homeostatic regulation of our vascular system. So in order to maintain homeostasis in our cardiovascular system and provide adequate blood to the tissues, our blood flow must be redirected continually to the tissues as they become more active. So this chart here is going to show a distribution of the blood during rest, during mild or light exercise, and then during heavy or maximal exercise. So at rest, our cardiac output averages about 5,800 milliliters per minute. And then during light exercise, aka mild exercise, the cardiac output's going to rise to approximately 9,500 milliliters a minute. And this is largely due to the increased venous return. And then we have the distribution during heavy exercise, where the cardiac output's going to rise toward a maximal level of 17,500 milliliters per minute. Okay, you can see those totals right here on the bottom of the chart. So this chart looks really kind of complex. Shows a summary of factors for maintaining vascular homeostasis. I'll just kind of talk through some of the key points here, and you can reference the chart as needed. It's a flow chart, so if you follow it based on the descriptions I give, I think you'll be able to make sense of it. So when we're talking about neural regulation, the cardiovascular centers, which are located within the hypothalamus of the brain, which is a key component of the reticular activation system, they make extensive adjustments to cardiac output and blood distribution during these changes in physical activity that we looked at here. We have what we call baroreceptors reflex, which is BRR. And these baroreceptors are located in the carotid sinuses, the aorta, and the right atrium. And basically, they're going to detect changes in blood pressure. So when these receptors detect an increase in blood pressure, they're going to send signals to the hypothalamus, which is going to in turn trigger vasodilation, which we know is a decrease in the heart rate, and also a reduction in cardiac output. When they detect a decrease in the blood pressure, these BRRs will also send a signal to the hypothalamus, which in turn is going to trigger vasoconstriction. All right, so here's where we are able to maintain homeostasis. We get the increase in heart rate and then the increase in cardiac output. Okay, very similar process here that we're going to follow with the chemoreceptor reflex, also known as CRR. So the chemoreceptors that we learned about in A&P1 are also located within the carotid sinuses and the aortic arch. They're going to detect changes in blood composition. All right, so the baroreceptors detect the changes in blood pressure. Now these chemoreceptors are going to detect changes in blood composition. When the chemoreceptors detect an increase in carbon dioxide, or we could say a decrease in oxygen concentration, they stimulate mechanisms such as vasoconstriction or increased cardiac output and blood pressure. Okay, so depending on the situation, depending on what's being detected, there's going to be some sort of stimulated effect in terms of the mechanisms, including vasoconstriction or, again, increased cardiac output or blood pressure. And then for your reference, really what we were discussing there is this part of the chart, and also part of the top here, the neural mechanisms that all lead us back to homeostasis being restored. Now we're going to talk about the bottom part of the chart here, the chart portion that focuses on endocrine control. And again, will lead us back to homeostatic restoration. So what's key here at play is the epinephrine and norepinephrine. These are secreted by the medulla of our adrenal gland, and they're going to increase our heart rate, as we learned in A&P1, which in turn is going to increase our cardiac output. So there's a direct correlation there. The increases in cardiac output cause the increased blood pressure. Okay, then we have the antidiuretic hormone, okay, which is there. And that's secreted by the pituitary glands. Antidiuretic hormone is also called ADH. So ADH is going to enhance the water reabsorption in the kidney so that the urine output is reduced and the blood volume rises. So we're going to see an increased blood volume, which will lead to an increased blood pressure. And we'll do one more here. We'll talk about aldosterone. All right, so with the aldosterone, a lot of times we get a drop in blood pressure or blood volume, which is detected by the baroreceptors, once again, in the kidney. And then we have something called renin, which is released, and it activates the angiotensin, okay? And it's converted to the activated angiotensin 2, which is a potent vasoconstrictor. This increases the peripheral resistance, and the blood pressure essentially rises. Important for you to know that we obviously need to have the other part of the endocrine system working to maintain homeostasis. So here, what we're going to have stimulated is both what we call ANP and BNP, which is the atrial natriuretic peptide and the brain natriuretic peptide. Which is produced by the muscle cells of the ventricles. And what this is going to do is it's going to reduce sodium reabsorption so that the body experiences an increase in sodium loss in the urine. So the water follows the sodium, so the blood volume declines. And this process here is going to inhibit the release of what we've talked about, the aldosterone, the epinephrine, the norepinephrine, and all of these things together are going to lower the blood pressure. Okay, so that's where we get our balance to restore homeostasis. Same thing with nitric oxide. That's a potent vasodilator. Okay, that's going to reduce the peripheral resistance and then essentially will reduce the blood pressure. So there we talk to you about the ones that are going to increase the blood pressure, and then the ones that are going to help reduce the blood pressure to regulate the homeostasis and essentially restore the homeostasis within the body. And then this chart basically shows that as the blood pressure increases, the baroreceptors fire more strongly. If the blood pressure decreases, the baroreceptors don't fire as much. And with each of those happenings, you can see what other things will be happening in tandem and what those would lead to. Okay, the up arrows show an increase, the down arrows show a decrease. And then again, each of these charts is going to show how this sequence leads to homeostasis being restored. Same thing down here. And if you'd like to see an animation of the baroreceptors, you can look at that through this link. Okay, so as we talked about at the conclusion of Anatomy and Physiology 1, we know that oftentimes within our bodies, the nervous system and the endocrine system are working very closely together. We call that, a lot of times we'll say, the neuroendocrine system. And so here you can see when we have a decreased blood pressure and volume, here's what the endocrine system does. Here's what the nervous system does to keep our bodies within homeostasis. Now let's talk about some clinical considerations in the cardiovascular system. So what pathologies could exist causing an imbalance in homeostasis? Well, we have hypertension, which is important to know. Hypertension is high blood pressure. Clinically, with our patients, we'll encounter that quite a bit. And generally, hypertension is considered to be 140/90 for a blood pressure or above. Hypotension is low blood pressure. That's generally considered to be 90/60. Hypovolemic shock, that results from a large-scale blood loss. I'll kind of just work my way down this list here. Cardiogenic shock is a pump failure. That's going to occur when the heart gets to be so insufficient that it can't sustain adequate circulation. So we see that once again in myocardial infarction, also known as a heart attack, which we learned in an earlier lecture, or congestive heart failure, also known as CHF. It can also be due to arrhythmias. Cardiogenic shock can be due to valve disorders, cardiac failure, and I can go on with some more, but those are some of the most common. Then we have vascular shock, which occurs when the blood volume is normal and constant, but there's poor circulation due to some sort of extreme vasodilation, which in turn drops the blood pressure. Again, we call that vascular shock. Then we have obstructive shock, which is going to occur when a significant portion of the vascular system is blocked. So it's not always recognized as a distinct condition. because sometimes it's hard to gauge, so it may be grouped with cardiogenic shock. Then we have an aneurysm, which is the ballooning of a blood vessel, which is going to increase the risk of rupture. Then we have finally a cerebral vascular accident. So some of you, depending on your instructor, may have done practice with the FAST assessment in A&P1. We were talking about how to best assess for an acute stroke. So that's what we're assessing for. We're assessing for a CVA, cerebral vascular accident. Okay, it's more commonly called a stroke. It's alluding to a reduced blood supply to the brain of some sort. It's a reduced blood supply to the brain. So let's look at the interaction of the circulatory system with the other body systems, most of which we've already learned about, and then the ones we haven't, we'll be learning about in this course. So you can see the system listed in the first column there on the left, and the column on the right shows its specific role. So with this here, you should be able to have a general sense of what each system's role is in terms of circulation. And then for a little bit more about the major arteries, which we bring in at this point, you can look at this link here, which is attached. Okay, and then finally, here is a look at your pulmonary circuit. It shows, as you can see in the caption, blood exiting from the right ventricle, which flows into the pulmonary trunk, which bifurcates, that means splits apart, into the two pulmonary arteries. These vessels are going to branch to supply blood to the pulmonary capillaries, where gas exchange occurs within the lung alveoli, and then the blood returns via the pulmonary veins to the left atrium. All right, so this diagram does a really good job of showing the arrows of this process, the pulmonary circuit. Okay, and then we mentioned arteries a couple slides ago. So we have major systemic arteries in our body, and those arteries are shown in this picture here. So they're going to deliver the oxygenated blood throughout our bodies. Okay, we talked about the aorta a little bit earlier in the course. So we can see here that it has distinct regions. We have the ascending aorta, the aortic arch, the descending aorta, and that's going to include the thoracic and abdominal regions. Here's a close-up look at the arteries that supply the head and neck, and then a look at the arteries serving the brain from the inferior view. Arteries serving the thoracic and upper limb, and the lower limb. And now we look at some veins. So here are the systemic veins from an anterior view. As you can see in most of our lab models as well, arteries will be shown in red, veins will be shown in blue. Okay, here's a close-up look at the veins of the abdominal pelvic cavity and the veins of the head and neck, veins of the upper limb, and veins of the lower limb. So that's going to conclude the first part of chapter 20, and I'll be resuming this lecture with part 2.